All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Glad that you were able to join us. This is another webinar in kind of a series that we've been doing that have been more focused on the winery general order. This is a bit more specific, focusing on packaged treatment plants, which can be tied to some of the requirements or implications associated with the general order, but also may be of interest to folks that are just curious about package systems, irrespective of any of the regulatory requirements. Jason Flowers, who's a senior project manager in our group, will be conducting most of the presentation and speaking on the technical content. He is well versed in helping clients evaluate different treatment technologies and helping to find the best fit, since each of our clients are looking at different criteria to decide what is a better fit for their facility. And he's worked with many people in seeing things through all the way from vendor evaluation through permitting, design, construction. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jason. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the intro, Gina. Getting into the presentation in terms of what we're going to be covering today, we'll start off just with an overview of available process wastewater treatment technologies. Then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of the technologies that are out there. Next, we'll talk about some of the available package systems that are on the market. We'll walk through the technology selection process, and then into the design and permitting process for package treatment systems. To tie things all together with some of the previous webinars, as Gina mentioned, we'll talk about general order compliance and what's required from a regulatory perspective for these systems. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about the operations and maintenance requirements, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers in case anybody has specific things that they'd like us to cover in more detail. As engineers, we love our acronyms, so you're going to hear a lot of them throughout the presentation today. I'm not going to go through each of these one by one, but these are some of the common ones that you'll see. As Gina mentioned, this will be recorded, and you guys can always go back and refer back to these acronyms. But PW, winery process wastewater, is one that you'll hear a lot. And the various CBs or the control boards, the State Water Resources Control Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Board. So in terms of an overview of process wastewater pretreatment, we generally split it into larger categories. So the first category is pretreatment. That can be relatively crude things like a floor screen, an equalization tank, pH adjustment. The next step in the process is primary treatment. That's something that would include physical treatment for fine solids removal, or a partitioning process like sedimentation, flotation, or a rotary screen. When we start talking about secondary treatment, that's frequently going to be a biological treatment step to reduce the biochemical oxygen demand. Another example of secondary treatment would be a lagoon system, whether that be aerobic or facultative. Activated sludge systems are secondary treatment systems, as are bioreactors. The final step in the process is tertiary treatment, and that's generally what we refer to as polishing. It's not bulk treatment at that point. It's just kind of a final step in the process to get through and remove any residual particulate or suspended solids through some sort of a physical, mechanical, or chemical process. So a package treatment system is something that combines two or more of these steps kind of in one unit operation, that can occupy a smaller footprint by combining multiple treatment steps into one sort of system. So the most obvious comparison of the alternative to package treatment system is a pond. And I'm sure that's something that almost everybody on the call today is familiar with. Maybe you have one at your facility. You've probably seen them somewhere. Some of the advantages of ponds is that they're relatively low from an annual maintenance perspective. It can be a quick check in the morning to make sure that aerators are running, but it's not a really operator intensive system on a daily basis. Another advantage of a pond, it's obviously a natural feature. You can have some vegetation out there, which can help with the aesthetic appeal of it. And then in addition to the maintenance, the actual operational oversight, again, on a daily basis of a pond is relatively straightforward. Some of the disadvantages of ponds, it can be a very, very large footprint depending on the volume of processed wastewater that a facility is processing. That can be mitigated slightly with some of the more efficient aeration options that are available on the market, but the fact remains that a pond is going to take up a relatively large amount of site. They can also be high energy consumption, particularly if you've got large mechanical surface aerators that are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, there are ways to mitigate that. You can put the aerators on dissolved oxygen control. You can have them on on-off control. There are ways that you don't have to run them full bore 24/7, but nevertheless, they can be significant power consumption. Although it's not a daily or a monthly requirement, sludge removal is something that is a significant cost. We typically see facilities removing sludge every 7 to 10 years, and it's a fairly involved process that does contribute significant O&M cost. Finally, a relatively new con with ponds is the general order is going to require facilities with ponds to perform leak testing to show that the liner is operating as intended and that none of the wastewater is potentially leaching into the groundwater. The liner leak test itself is not that expensive of a procedure, but if you fail a leak test, you're potentially in a situation where you need to replace the entire liner. And if you have large ponds, if you have multiple ponds, replacement of a liner can be a significant project, both in terms of time and CapEx. So now into kind of the focus of today's webinar, and that's the package system. So when you compare package systems to something like a pond, one of the major pros is that you can produce a really high quality effluent that has increased potential for reuse beyond even vineyard irrigation. There are some opportunities to reuse it within the winery, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation. But you can absolutely get higher quality effluent out of a package system than something like a pond. Other advantages include compact footprint. Like we talked about, ponds take up a large amount of space. The package systems can occupy a much smaller area and free up more space on your site for other things. Modular designs are part of package systems. If it's something where you're increasing your production over time, you don't necessarily have to put forward all the CapEx all up front. The system can be planned out and designed such that you add to it in the future as your production increases. Automation is another advantage of these systems. They have the ability to be monitored remotely, send you alerts on your phone when a certain setting is out of whack. There's really an opportunity to have them be highly automated and monitored remotely. And then lastly, the opportunity for offsite fabrication. If you're building a new winery, if you have a lot of activities going on site, and stick building a wastewater treatment system is disruptive to your ongoing operations, some of these systems can be largely fabricated off-site so that when they're shipped to site, it becomes an exercise of hooking up power, hooking up utilities, and it takes, weeks to get them up and running rather than months and months and months of field construction time. In terms of the cons of the systems, there is still some solids associated with these package systems, especially with the biological systems. You're going to generate sludge that needs to be managed and hauled off site occasionally. They are relatively operator intensive just because there's rotating equipment involved. You typically have blowers, pumps, things that need to be checked frequently, bearings that need to be lubricated, filters that need to be changed, all of that sort of stuff that goes along with rotating equipment. They are typically higher capital cost upfront because it tends to be a more advanced system, and with that comes cost. And then depending on the technology, they can be energy intensive. A large system could potentially have pretty significant blowers that would increase the power consumption of the system. So there are lots and lots and lots of different package systems on the market today. Quite a few of them have been installed at wineries and proven to operate effectively. Really, the right answer for any given site varies from site to site. Every vendor out there has advantages and disadvantages, and Summit has worked with a lot of our clients to assess those advantages and disadvantages and help to determine what is the right option for each site. We're technology neutral. We're not affiliated with any of these vendors. And so we can work with clients to go out and get multiple proposals, make sure that they're being evaluated on a like basis, and then work with the owner to select a technology that's appropriate for your site. There are lots of these systems installed all throughout Northern California, quite a few in Napa and Sonoma. If it's something where you and your operations staff are interested in going out and taking a look at one of the systems that's in operation, that's absolutely something that we can help to facilitate. You can contact any of us if that's something that would be of interest. So examples of some of the package system vendors that are out there. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list. It's not intended to capture every single technology on the market. These are just a few of the vendors that we've worked with recently, either in terms of evaluating their technology in a potential application, or actually installing a system at a local winery, brewery, etc. Like I said, each one of the technologies absolutely has merit. They're all, proven out there, working well, and it really is a site-specific exercise to determine which one is going to be the optimal option. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking individually about these technologies today, because the intent of this presentation is just to more walk through the process. But if you are interested in one of these vendors specifically, feel free to contact us and we can give you some more information and talk through the details of their process. So the first step when a client is interested in moving forward with the package treatment system is to go through a technology evaluation. And so at the beginning of that process, we, Summit, would align with the client to understand what are the key considerations in the project. So some of the typical drivers that we look at include capital cost, life cycle cost, which is of course the capital plus the operating over a certain payback period. Aesthetics are very important to some facilities, especially when the facility is going to place the wastewater treatment system near a hospitality area. Footprint can be an important consideration. As I mentioned earlier, the package systems have the ability to be much smaller than something like a pond. So if you have space constraints on site, if you want to plant more vineyard, if you just want the system to be out of the way, out of sight, the package treatment system can be a very good option for achieving that. Energy consumption is typically tied in with the life cycle cost and the OpEx. But as energy rates continue to increase and focus on sustainability goes up, energy consumption can be a key driver for a lot of clients. Influent criteria is an important thing to evaluate, both in terms of the flow rate, gallons per day, as well as the quality. If you have a process on site that's producing real high strength wastewater, for example, stillage waste, that influences the type of technologies that we would look at. And then finally, the effluent quality and potential for reuse. The end use of the treated wastewater goes a long ways in dictating what sort of technologies make the most sense. And we'll talk a little bit more about potential options for reuse. Most people are probably aware that the state of California has continued to implement stricter and stricter regulations on groundwater usage. That's led to people paying a lot more attention to how much water they're utilizing, an enhanced focus overall on sustainability, and potentially looking at areas where treated wastewater can be reused on site. So the most obvious option, and probably the most common one, is vineyard and landscape irrigation. Typically, the water from ponds is suitable to do this. The package treatment systems can get you slightly better effluent quality if your vineyard management team has specific requirements, but it does bear mentioning that the package treatment systems typically reduce biochemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, and total nitrogen. So if you're concerned about concentrations of bicarbonate or concentrations of boron or something else in the water that's going on your vineyard irrigation, that's typically going to be a different treatment system than these wastewater package treatment systems that we're talking about today. If you want to go beyond irrigation use, there is an opportunity to reuse the wastewater in the winery. Some of the recent examples that we've seen include the first rinse of wine tanks. So after the wine comes out of the tank, the treated process wastewater would be used for the initial rinse, and then supplemental rinses could be done with fresh water. We've seen facilities pipe it back into buildings and reuse the treated wastewater for toilet flushing. We've seen it used to hose down processing areas after grapes are brought in. In some of the in-building reuse applications, it is worth mentioning that additional treatment may be required. So examples of that include disinfection, whether that be UV or chlorine. UV tends to be more common. Tannin removal is another step. If the wastewater is going to be used in an application where the color could potentially be an issue, for example, in toilet flushing, we'd recommend tannin removal to make sure that the fresh water that's being plumbed in isn't discolored at all. It's also worth mentioning that most of these package treatment systems do not remove salts. And so as you recycle water through the system, you will see a buildup of salts. And that's something that can be important to track if the ultimate outlet is going to be irrigation. Using wastewater with a high salinity concentration can have an adverse effect on certain crops. So if reuse is an option, one of the things that we always go through with clients is trying to understand what levels of salts or total dissolved solids are acceptable in the effluent. So the actual evaluation and selection process, once we've aligned on some of the key criteria, the first step is that Summit will put together design criteria that typically includes things like the average and maximum flow rate to the system, the incoming wastewater strength, and then the desired effluent quality. We also address the seasonality of flows in that design criteria. We review that with the client, and then we develop a request for proposal that goes out to multiple vendors. The vendors get that RFP, they develop their proposals, they send it in to us. We spend some time reviewing the proposals with an eye on identifying any gaps in the proposals, any clarifications that need to be made, or any additional information that we need to make sure that we're comparing vendors on a similar basis. Each of the vendors typically has different capabilities. And so it's important to analyze what they're offering, identify what might be missing, and make sure that it's being accounted for in the evaluation. Once all that's complete, we've gone through, we've reviewed the proposals, we've had calls and emails back and forth with the vendor. We typically generate a summary report that we can issue to the client, and then we'll schedule either a phone call or an in-person meeting to go through that result with you, answer any questions, and determine how to move forward with the project. So this is an example of what the template looks like that we typically use when we're creating a comparison report. The first 4 items up there are just intended to capture the capital cost of the system. Like I mentioned, different vendors have different scope capabilities. So there are some vendors that will just supply you with equipment, whereas there are other vendors that have the ability to supply equipment and then also come out to the site and do the installation. So as part of the clarifications, it's important for us to understand what the vendor's offering, and if there is a gap in their scope, making sure that we account for it when we're generating the cost estimate. The other kind of standard things that go in our report template include things like footprint. As we talked about, that can be an important consideration for a lot of clients. Effluent quality, particularly with an eye on how is it going to be reused. 10-year life cycle cost with a separate breakout of power consumption, and then just highlighting some advantages and disadvantages of each technology. Finally, we'd address typical lead times. You know, if there's a project with a tight schedule, lead time could be a consideration in selecting a vendor. And lastly, we'll evaluate performance guarantees and warranties that are associated with each system. And of course, this template is exactly that. It's a template. If there are other things that are important to your facility or that you'd like us to evaluate, they can certainly be added on a case-by-case basis. Permitting, everybody's favorite topic. The requirements do vary based on the project location and how the effluent is ultimately being disposed of. If you are applying the treated effluent to land, there's going to be a different set of regulations than if it's being applied to a surface water or if it's being discharged to, say, a city sewer connection. The folks that are typically involved in regulating these systems are the State Water Resources Control Board, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and or the local authority having jurisdiction. So that's, for example, Sonoma County or the city of Santa Rosa. Depending on the details of your project, one or multiple of these entities may be involved. And again, that's something where when we understand where your project is located, what the size is, that's something that we can help you to work through. Project permitting can take a very long time. And so it's important to understand the requirements early on so that you're submitting the applications you need early enough in the process that you'll have your operating permits available when you're ready to get the system online. Believe it or not, sometimes the permitting of these systems can take longer than the actual construction of them. So it is important to have the sequence right. Waste discharge requirements, which are typically kind of the governing document that's going to be issued prior to discharge with these types of system, do need to be in place prior to the actual discharge. So you can begin construction without those waste discharge requirements, but before it's actually operating and discharging treated wastewater, you need to have the WDRs in place. Project execution, as I mentioned earlier, vendor capabilities differ with respect to design and construction. There are some vendors that are just going to produce specialized components of the system, but for example, the actual treatment tanks are going to need to be procured by the contractor. There are other vendors that can fabricate the whole system offsite in a fabrication shop, and pretty much everything shows up just ready for utility and power connections. It just varies vendor to vendor. And so it's important early on in the project to understand who's doing what. For some of the systems, the general contractor is going to have a lot more scope to do. For others, they're really just providing single point of connections and interfaces. Definition of those interfaces is very important early on in the process to make sure that we don't miss something either in terms of design or construction. So one of the things that we typically utilize here is a design basis document that's really intended to clarify who's doing what and what each organization, whether that be Summit, the vendor, the contractor, or the owner, has responsibility for. And getting aligned on that upfront just helps things to go smoothly as we move through the process, and hopefully leads to fewer surprises when we're out in the field trying to hook everything up. So the overall project execution, once a vendor has been selected, the vendor is typically going to be released for their design effort. So the typical vendor drawings that we see are general arrangement or GA drawings that just show the overall footprint of each piece of equipment and how things are laid out relative to one another. Electrical loads are going to be provided for each motor in the system so that our electrical group can go about designing the power feeder. And vendors typically provide P&IDs that just show all the controls, instrumentation, and piping to and from the system. After we get the vendor design package, Summit will develop the actual permit drawings that are required for submittal to the county. We'll talk about this a little bit more on a later slide, but the county typically does require a building permit for these systems. And so using the vendor information, we develop the drawings and the calculations that are required to get that building permit. Next step in the process is the authority having jurisdiction review. So that's the initial review of our submittal. They typically issue plan check comments. And then once those plan check comments have been issued, the building permit is issued for the project and construction can start. And then, of course, the construction phase, the getting the equipment out to site, hooking everything up, installing it, and then start up and commissioning. As we mentioned earlier, the discharge permit or the waste discharge requirements do need to be issued before you're actually discharging the wastewater. So not a prerequisite for construction, but they do need to be in place before the system's actually operating and discharging treated wastewater. So to kind of tie everything back to the statewide winery general order that we've talked about in previous webinars, the state general order is intended to govern any sort of a winery treatment system that's discharging treated effluent to land, for example, for irrigation or to a subsurface disposal system. And so some package systems will be required to enroll in the general order, whereas others may not be. It's really dictated by the type of disposal of the treated effluent. The general order enrollment may eliminate the need for the county to issue a septic permit. It varies county to county. Napa County is typically going to require a septic permit, whereas Sonoma County will not. But in both counties, we do typically see them ask for a building permit for these systems. And so you're most likely going to have some county involvement in addition to the Regional Water Quality Control Board and or State Water Quality Control Board. And then the middle bullet on there is just making sure that, you know, we're considering the limits for all of the various constituents in the design process so that at the end of the day, we produce a system that does meet the regulatory requirements that it needs to meet. Operations and maintenance, as I mentioned, there is a little bit more to operating these systems relative to something like a pond. They're more highly automated, there's more equipment in the system, and with that comes a need for more maintenance. The operations and maintenance capability of each vendor does vary vendor by vendor. Some of them have a pretty strong local presence and teams that can come out and do, you know, weekly checks of the system and essentially take care of all the maintenance. Some of the other systems that don't have as much of a local presence can help with some remote monitoring, but it's harder for them to get on site. There are companies, third-party companies that can operate the package treatment systems. So even if it's an out-of-state vendor, there are multiple companies in the area that are available and have certified operators on site that can handle the vast majority of the operations and maintenance. Vendors can also train winery employees to operate the system. It varies facility to facility as to what's the best option. If you have staff available that can spend the time learning and operating the wastewater system, that can potentially be more cost effective. If your operations staff is spread pretty thin and has lots of other responsibilities, it may make more sense to contract with another company to do the daily and the monthly operations and maintenance and reporting. So that was most of the content for today. We did want to leave quite a bit of time at the end to answer any questions that you guys may have, either general or facility specific. So I know Josh has been keeping track of questions while I've been talking. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him kind of moderate the Q&A session. And Gina and I will alternate and kind of work together to answer any of your questions. If there's anything that we don't get to or that you would like additional information on, you can feel free to contact any of us in the wastewater group. My email is up there. Gina's was earlier in the presentation, or any of the other folks in our division, Rebecca, Josh, Callie, or Julian, all available to answer any questions that you have. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh.
All righty. Thank you, Jason. So let's get started here. Again, feel free to use the chat to enter in any more questions that show up. We'll be starting with some questions that were emailed in before the meeting. So the first one that gets brought up is, what is available for small capacity wastewater solids removal and sludge dewatering? So Jason, you had mentioned that, you know, these systems, even though they're not ponds, they generate sludge. So how is that getting handled on site for these package systems?
So there are a couple different options for the sludge management. It can be taken out and stored temporarily on site in tanks. Another option is to add additional dewatering equipment to reduce the total volume of the solids and the associated disposal fee. So there is an additional CapEx for that dewatering equipment. And we can work with owners to determine if it makes sense to spend that money to potentially save on the off-haul fees associated with getting that sludge off-site. Gina, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that if you are, you would rather manage the solids on site and store in a tank, you could potentially add it to your pomace processing area and compost it on site once it's dried out. In addition, I've heard of a few vendors that are looking into leasing out like a rental fleet of these dewatering pieces of equipment rather than facilities having to invest in purchasing their own. So that could be something on the horizon as an alternative as well.
Okay, and kind of tying into this issue of disposal, what about brine generation? So either RO reject or just whenever salts accumulate, how can these facilities deal with any brine?
So the brine can potentially be sent to the process wastewater system. The general order has a prohibition against water softener reject going to the PW system, but brine from, for example, an RO system could go to the PW treatment system. It's important to emphasize, though, that most of the systems out there, especially the biological ones, are not going to get the salts out of that brine stream. It's just going to be a pass-through that ultimately ends up wherever the water is going. So it can go to the system, but you're not necessarily going to get treatment through a lot of the package systems. Gina, anything to add?
Yeah, just to add on to what you said, Jason, we've had experience with some facilities. It's not necessarily associated with RO, but Jason had mentioned this in the presentation as well, but there could be a buildup of TDS in the effluent, whether it's from brine reject or otherwise. And if a facility is reusing that water, it will continue to become more concentrated in the effluent stream. And so at that point, you would need to implement an RO treatment process to further refine whatever effluent it is that you're using for reuse. So that's another add-on treatment component that we would want to take into account during the design criteria phase.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, getting more county specific. So somebody asks, if I have an existing system in Napa County, will I need to comply with the winery general order?
The most likely answer is yes. It does depend on how you're using the treated effluent. If it's being discharged to land, then yes, you will need to comply with the winery general order by the January 2024 deadline. Gina, did you have anything additional there?
The only update that I have is I spoke with Kim Withrow last week, and she said that they've been having ongoing discussions with the state about compliance. And what the state has said is there's one little condition in the general order that says if you have an operating or an existing WDR or an operating permit with Napa County and you are in compliance in terms of operations and reporting, that there could be an extension to that January deadline. But again, you have to be in good working order, and it's just is buying some additional time for having to enroll in a new order as long as you have that kind of, you can bridge the gap and show that you're permitted and compliant. It will happen at some point. They just haven't given a definitive date. They're going to start targeting the facilities that are either they don't have any existing permits, discharge permits, or they're out of compliance. That's where they're going to start.
Okay, and then kind of a similar train of thought there. What are these facilities really required to install? Is the state saying that they specifically need a package treatment system, that they need something more specific? What's going to be required?
Definitely not required to install a package treatment system. Again, the effluent requirements are really dictated by where the treated effluent is going. So there's one set of effluent requirements if it's being applied to land. For example, for irrigation, you're looking at, pounds per acre per day of BOD. There's another set of requirements on the effluent quality if it's going to a subsurface disposal system. And so there are lots of different ways to get there. A pond could be an option. A package treatment system could be an option. Some combination of those secondary and primary treatment technologies that we talked about without necessarily being a package treatment system. There are lots and lots of options to get there. And it just depends on the facility's needs and requirements to evaluate which one makes the most sense. But no, the state is not requiring package treatment systems for wineries.
The only thing that I would add is that if a facility has a vast amount of land for land application, technically you could get away with discharging untreated wastewater if you can meet that loading requirement. But that is kind of an anomaly unless you have a vast amount of land. And then on the flip side, most facilities don't want to put raw wastewater on their land just from being good stewards of the land, and or they don't want to degrade a crop that they're trying to grow. So that can be the one caveat in terms of what's technically required. In addition, aside from all the permitting requirements, facilities might have some sort of internal sustainability goal in terms of reuse or just treatment, energy usage perspective that might be the driver for the desire to install a package system. It might not be related to regulatory requirements.
Okay, going to the realm of maintenance. What are some preventative maintenance items for these package treatment systems? For ponds, it might be regularly desludging, but what can you do on a preventative basis for these systems?
Probably the best thing to do is just the daily checks of the system, just to make sure that things are operating the way they should be. In terms of preventative maintenance, most of it is around the rotating equipment. So it's going to be things like oil changes, filter changes on your blowers, lubricating bearings, just checking, much like you do with your car, preventative maintenance to make sure that the equipment's going to last as long as it possibly can. Things like the membranes in systems that have membranes, there are typically relatively automated clean in place procedures that use chemicals while the membrane remains in the system to kind of clean everything off of it. So pulling out the membrane and scrubbing it is not something you're going to be doing regularly. So most of the preventative maintenance is just around your daily checks to make sure that everything looks to be operating in good procedure. And then kind of the standard stuff that you do on rotating equipment like pumps and blowers elsewhere in the winery. Gina, anything else?
The only thing I'd add to that one is that as long as you have somebody doing those daily checks, like Jason mentioned, it's in the facility's best interest to be doing that to be monitoring the flows and looking at the influent quality so that they can make sure their system is in spec with what the system was designed for. Because if there's a performance guarantee in place, you want to make sure you have all the records showing that what you're sending to the system is what was agreed upon, so that if there are any sort of treatment mishaps and it's not meeting the quality that was agreed upon, that you have something to fall back on and say, well, I've been doing all the monitoring and all the criteria meets what we agreed on, so we need to troubleshoot and fix the problem. The only addition to that would be, package systems aren't only available for process wastewater, industrial wastewater. We've also designed and installed them for domestic systems where there are limitations in terms of just subsurface disposal. And those systems in particular, because of the domestic waste component, require some additional treatment steps such as disinfection, and that can push facilities into the realm of needing a certified operator. And so that can require some additional oversight that we would take into account when we're doing the cost analysis, because that can add just another layer of complexity that we want you to be aware of.
Okay, so there was some good discussion on, tailoring package treatment systems to the quality of effluent that's needed. Kind of going to the base or the most common effluent application process for vineyard irrigation or landscape irrigation. Is there a certain level of treatment that we want these systems to target so that either it's biofilm or solids don't end up clogging drip lines or spray emitters?
Yeah, in terms of plugging up the irrigation system, even if it's not a membrane-based technology, there are absolutely irrigation filters that you can put upstream of the pump so that plugging up your emitters in the irrigation system isn't much of a concern. At the end of the day, what is acceptable quality to apply to vineyard is something that we work with each facility to understand. Different vineyard managers have different requirements, different winemakers have different opinions. The answer might be different if the wastewater is being applied to your best block of Cabernet versus if it's being applied on a fallow field. But in terms specifically of plugging up emitters with solids, with almost any technology that can be handled with filtration in the irrigation system.
Next question. Again, kind of on the topic of effluent quality. Can these package treatment systems get the effluent, clean enough such that they can start being reused as ingredients for whatever the process is, whether it's wineries, breweries? Can it start being used in the production of these items?
The technology is probably there to do it. I think there would absolutely be some regulatory hurdles. I have not specifically seen or know of a facility where they're actually using treated wastewater to produce a product that's intended for human consumption. I think it could head that direction in the future. I think the technology is probably pretty close to there, if not there, but it's not something that I've actually seen or am familiar with.
Yeah, similarly to what Jason's saying, if the water reuse is going to be used in a way that there will be human consumption, the set of requirements aren't quite there yet. However, we see that water being used all the time for non-potable water uses. So that's been our experience. I know that there are groups of people that are trying to change the ways, but I think the politics and the regulations have a bit of time to catch up.
Okay, going back to the topic of modularity. So say a winery is planning to increase their production. They've got a phased approach where they'll increase initially, kind of immediately, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years, they're planning for another jump up in production. How can these package treatment systems be designed, installed? How can they match the phasing of production increases?
So the package systems do lend themselves very well to modularity. In the example you mentioned, Josh, you could install one treatment train at the beginning and then put a second train in parallel that would say double the treatment capacity 10 years down the road when that production increase happens. So, mirroring a second treatment train is the most obvious example. It is very important to think about future growth during the initial design phase. So, for example, in the example you mentioned, with a winery that is initially going to have not a lot of production and not a lot of processed wastewater, it makes a lot of sense to pre-invest in certain things. So, for example, the piping to the system, it would probably make sense to size that up for the ultimate flow at the end. Things like the power that's being run out to the system, it makes a lot of sense to pre-invest in that so that it's not so disruptive when you do want to go in and add additional treatment equipment in the future. So knowing about phasing plans and going through that at the beginning of the alignment can make the whole process a lot easier, a lot more cost effective, a lot faster from a schedule perspective, if we understand what those potential future add-ons or increases in production capacity are going to be.
What's the smallest size that these package systems can come in terms of capacity? Are kind of building off that phased approach, what's the minimum that we've seen get installed?
As you've probably come to expect by now, it depends a little bit on the technology. I would say kind of a lower end size for most of these systems is in the 500 gallon per day range. With that said, as a one-off, I did do a package treatment system for domestic wastewater that was just over 200 gallons per day. But in general, I think the lower end of the size range is around 500 gallons per day. And that's when I say 500 gallons per day, that's the peak processed wastewater flow during harvest. Gina, anything else?
Yeah, just to tack on to that, I think there's been a lot of advancement in the package treatment system world in terms of making these systems more scalable and more cost effective. 10 plus years ago, you had to have 5 to 10,000 gallon per day minimum in order to have installing one of these make economical sense, and that a lot of vendors have been working to make their systems more scalable on the lower flow ranges because there's a demand for it in the wine industry and beyond. So a lot has changed in the past 10 years.
Let's squeeze this last one in, just because I think it's a nice wrap up to this. How does the new general order affect the operations of existing wineries, whether or not they already have a package treatment system?
It's mainly just going to be around the change in monitoring and reporting requirements. Most of these package treatment systems produce relatively high quality effluent. And at the end of the day, what the general order is looking at is effluent quality. There will potentially be changes to the monitoring and reporting requirements for the facility that's currently out there. Things like salt, total dissolved solids, like we talked about previously, a lot of the package treatment systems don't remove those. And so you would still need to be looking at the TDS or the FDS thresholds in the general order. But in general, most of these systems, I think, will continue to operate as they currently do, with the exception of the additional monitoring and reporting requirements and potentially some additional attention around the salt side of things. Gina, anything else?
Not really. I agree with what you said. And in addition, it would just be depending on the wastewater volume that the facility's generated will dictate what level of monitoring and reporting you need to do. For instance, the tier 4 facility is much larger PW production. You'll have more extensive groundwater monitoring. And so that'll be for facilities that have package systems, that'll be a majority of the investment is in the groundwater monitoring, well drilling component. All right. With that, thank you everyone for joining, and a huge thanks to Jason for conducting most of the presentation. As you can see, he's an expert in this realm, as are, the rest of the staff. We're here to support you guys. If you have questions that come up about package systems or otherwise, general order related, please let us know. I know it can be daunting, but we're here to help kind of lead you through the process and answer whatever questions come up for you. Also want to put in a plug, kind of as we're doing these webinars. The next one that we're planning on is going to be more on the operations side, because aside from regulatory compliance being overwhelming, operations of wastewater systems can be overwhelming as well. And Julian, who's on our staff, has a lot of operations experience. So we'd like to help ease your fears when it comes to the operations side of wastewater systems. Hopefully we'll be able to do a webinar and an on-site kind of walkthrough of one of these package systems and or a pond. So stay tuned for more to come on that. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.